Good afternoon, everyone. Also, good morning and good evening, depending on what time it is where you're tuning into this. Thank you for joining us for this panel discussion on navigating the digital economy, unlocking new global frontiers, supported by the Ministry of Economy and Planning of Saudi Arabia, programmed by Economist Impact. My name is Greg Karlstrom. I'm a Middle East correspondent for The Economist, based in Dubai. I'll be moderating this session for the next hour or so. I should say this is part of a broader series of events that we're doing on the evolving economy, looking at, as the name implies, how the economy is evolving, what's changing, what's gone well so far, and sort of what needs to be done to capitalize on opportunities in the future. And of course, the digital economy and digital transformation, one of the most important parts of that, one of the fastest growing sectors of the economy, and one that now touches almost every aspect of how we work, how we access government services, and how we live our lives. With us to discuss this today, we have four very knowledgeable panelists, and my job as moderator will be, for the most part, to sit here quietly and let them share their expertise. I'll introduce them in a moment. They'll make opening statements, then we'll do a couple of rounds of conversation. I will ask some questions to sort of frame the conversation, but I would encourage everyone on the panel, feel free to respond to each other, engage with each other, be as interactive as you want to be, or as interactive as one can be in a virtual forum. And then we have a number of questions that people in the audience have submitted ahead of time. And so we'll take the last 15 minutes or so at the end to try to get to as many of those questions as we can. So that's the topic, that's the format. Let me introduce our panelists, beginning with Farid Balhaj, who is the Vice President for the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank. Has held a number of other positions at the bank over the years, many of them with a focus on the Middle East. Next, we have Isabelle Durand, the Deputy Secretary General at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Previously held a number of high-level roles in the Belgian government, the European Parliament, and worked as a consultant for the UN Development Programme. Third, Gyat Chapsig, who is the Assistant Director for the Monetary and Capital Markets Department at the International Monetary Fund, has a portfolio that covers everything from central banks to fintech, and has worked on a number of IMF programs, both here in the region and elsewhere around the world. And last but not least, Bharat Vagadia, who is the Head of Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs for the Ooredoo Group, who works on projects and programs, I should say, in 10 different countries in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, and brings more than 25 years of experience in telecoms policy, regulation, and strategy to this conversation. So a big thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. Without further ado, let me turn it over to you for opening statements. We'll go in the order that you were introduced. So Farid, starting with you, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Greg. And let me say how glad I am to be with Isabelle and Gyat and Bharat in this conversation. It's going to be interesting. When one looks at or put in one sentence, government and disruption, it seems to be a bit awkward. Generally, governments are very conservative, and disrupting is quite an agenda. But when it comes to Saudi Arabia, I must say that over the last few years, we have seen, a lot in terms of trying to shake up, the way things go. And Saudi Arabia has become, a leading example in the Middle East and North Africa when it comes to opening up, the field for more innovation. So, the argument that the digitalization helps to sustain economic activity has, as we all know, has never been more obvious than during the crisis brought about by the global COVID-19 pandemic, and a shift towards a more virtual world through digital platforms and service delivery has really taken place. We see it happening in a number of countries, and again, let me stress, when it came to Saudi Arabia, this has really taken a very specific dimension. The country continues to open up, for instance, strengthen its infrastructure when it comes to deploying 5G networks, and has again set itself as an example. And when I sit where I'm sitting here in Washington and engaging in a number of policy conversations with the countries of the Middle East and North Africa, more often than not, the Saudi Arabia example, is a very powerful one that I'm putting forward. Second point I'd like to raise that goes also to Saudi Arabia, but much broader. The whole digital transition will need a stronger partnership between the public sector and the private sector. Need to engage more with youth, with civil society and academia, because this is, again, and should not be a top-down type of a conversation. It has to be a much broader, horizontal engagement. And not doing so will leave the region, to go into incremental progress, and there will be no real disruption at the time when we need that shake-up. That is really the key to what we are trying to do. I'll make one last point. When by current demographic trends in the Middle East and North Africa, by 2050, we will be looking at around 300 million young people knocking at the door of the job market. And those 300 million young people will not be getting their jobs out of the public sector. There is an absolute need to open the environment for private sector investment and for the private sector to breathe more freely. Part of the discussion will be through a transition that has a lot to do with the digital transformation of our region. So I believe that this is really one of the main drivers for us in the Middle East and North Africa, and for us here from the World Bank. It's jobs, jobs, jobs for young people, and part of it will be through this digital transformation. So over to you, and happy to engage in a conversation as we move forward.
Thank you, Farid. And yes, as you say, hard to have incremental progress when you have 300 million people coming up who will need jobs in the near future. Next, Isabel, we'll go to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And my perspective is a little bit broader than only the Middle East approach. In UNCTAD, we are working a lot to help and to try to support developing countries in the Middle East, but everywhere in the world, especially in the developing world, to really take benefit of digital economy. And just several observations to start. It's true that, and especially with the COVID, we have seen that much of the world increasingly went digital, but with a lot of course, uneven situation. And it's true that the problem is, and especially in the Middle East, is probably not exactly only the question of connectivity or connection, but the problem is more how, and it was just said, a strong disruptive approach can be developed. Also, regarding the capacity to understand the business model of the digital economy, because the business model is totally different as the previous model. And it's true that for me and for us in UNCTAD, the literacy in all the digital world is absolutely key. The other issue, which is also important for the Middle East, but everywhere, is the question of data, because data are becoming in this economy really a new value chain. And the question of data and the governance of data is absolutely key. I just achieved this first observation with two e-readiness assessments that we did in the region. It's Tunisia and Jordania. And in those two countries, the problem is less the question of connectivity, but especially in Tunisia, it was the question of exchange rate policy, which of course was an obstacle for cross-border trade. But there was no e-commerce if there is no cross-border trade. So that's one issue. Another issue, which is very concrete, is the logistic approach. How do you manage the last miles, and how do you manage the logistic aspect? And finally, the question of coordination within the government and the public authorities. And it's not a question of ICT minister or Secretary of State. It's a question of holistic approach of all the ecosystem of digital issue. And that's also key in order to incentivize the new, especially the young people, because each of them is not able to become from one day to another a good entrepreneur in the digital world. It requires a lot of of incentive information capacities, which are also to be developed through the political authorities and with a real will to change. And not only to have a big strategic plan and tick the box that we have a good plan, but something which is really concrete, with concrete measure on short term on how to develop and to protect. Also regard the legal framework, protect the consumer, protect the data privacy, cyber criminality, and all, which requires really a big attention from the public authorities. That's what I wanted to say in the beginning.
Okay, thank you, Isabel, and good to have a broader view that goes not just in the region, but beyond the region as well. Kiat, we'll turn to you, please.
Thank you very much, Greg, and I'm very delighted to be with my colleagues in this panel discussing this very timely and important topic. So let me follow up on Isabella and broaden up the horizon a little bit by bringing up perspectives and experiences that could be very relevant for developing the digital economy in the region, which is critically important, as Farid and Isabella has noted, with the opportunities to create jobs and improve growth, improving services and customer experience, and broadening the scope of for inclusion, which is very important, of marginalized populations. Of course, they come with challenges and risks that need to be mitigated and addressed. But let me add a couple of important factors here. The digital economy is giving emerging and developing economies the opportunity to leapfrog and accelerate their economic development, as well as diversifying their economies and broadening the scope of private sector participation. All of these factors are very important for the MENA region. Now, policymakers' engagement with the digital economies have evolved, obviously, with the technologies themselves. Initial focus has been on specific sectors, technologies like mobile banking from 10 years ago almost, and more recently on digital government. And this has been the case also for many countries. However, the rapid diffusion of technology in a broad aspect of economic and social life in recent years, and its impact, which was amply demonstrated during the COVID-19 epidemic, as pointed out by Farid and Isabella, have forced many policy makers to reconsider position and adopt a more holistic approach to this issue by developing national digital economy strategies over the past, and this is a new trend for the past 2-3 years. And these are proving to be a very useful tool and could be very useful also for facing the challenges facing the MENA region, the very complex economic and social challenges that are facing the region. So let me give a very quick highlight of some of the key outcomes of these efforts, and we can discuss further as we go in the discussion. So at the outset, policymakers must send really a clear signal about their commitment to develop the digital economy and highlight the strategic direction in a concrete way, as Isabel pointed out. And these signals are important to encourage and assure investors and entrepreneurs who are going to drive the growth of that digital economy. Now, we know that the digital transformation will have a broad social impact. So the process of preparing these strategies must be really inclusive of a broad spectrum of stakeholders to ensure the best use of resources and talent, but also to avoid the pitfalls that could come out, including unbalanced growth that could lead to concentration of economic powers and rising income inequalities. It is also important to recognize that digital economy strategy is not an IT project, which seems sometimes to be the first instincts of policy maker. It is really a powerful tool to achieve a broader development objective. So such strategies must be really rooted in the country's economic and social development objective. Developing such strategy must really be data-driven, based on an in-depth assessment of existing infrastructure, physical or otherwise, like legal foundations, for example, that are relevant to sustain this economy. And should take into account the extent of local digital adoption, transformation, and available skill. It will be also very useful for the preparation and implementation of the national digital economic strategy to be overseen by a centralized governance framework, and that is very important, to ensure coordination and resource allocation across sectors and to monitor implementations. Usually these arrangements vary across country depending on the institutional setups, obviously. But broadly, they would involve relevant line ministries overseen by a body with a broader view of development objectives, which could be Prime Minister's Office, Ministry of Economy, Finance, and so on. Finally, strong transparency and accountability framework is really important and should be embodied in the digital economy strategy. After all, the digital transformation will have a huge social impact, and its success will hinge on the stakeholders' trust about the fairness and effectiveness of the strategy's objectives and implementation process. So that means continuous engagement with the public and regular reporting. All of that will provide the necessary transparency for an effective accountability, which ultimately will drive success for these efforts. Let me stop here. I can pick up some of those issues as we go forward. Back to you, Greg.
Thank you, Giat, and good to point out that this is not an IT project, and hopefully we can come back to that point and elaborate on that a bit later, because that's an important point. Finally, Bharat, we'll go over to you. You've been waiting patiently all this time, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you to the fellow panelists here. Great start to the session. I'm going to try and paint an even broader picture, if I may. So the first thing is we see that many countries are trying to adopt digital technologies at speed, largely through necessity driven by COVID. Estimates point to something like 10 trillion in dollars of value that digitalization, automation, AI can bring over the next 10 years. And that represents a huge opportunity for countries to drive the economic growth in their nations. However, there's a complex and delicate web of policies and regulations required to foster that growth of digital technologies for their widespread adoption and for them to have a positive impact on their economies and society. And to make sense of that, you really need, to make sense of that order of complexity, you need a framework to understand how these technologies converge and what impact they may have. And actually, I've looked at this recently. I published a book on 2 years ago called Digital Disruption. So I'll try and extract some of my thoughts from that. At the basic level, you've got the connectivity layer. Without high-speed, ubiquitous, affordable connectivity, none of the digital applications can exist, right? However, connectivity does not necessarily mean 5G. So we can talk about that later on. Next is the kind of data capture layer. This is all about how devices such as IoT capture important data and how that's can be used to drive value and sometimes change how services are provided altogether. And we see this in a lot of the e-health, e-agriculture, e-commerce, etc. Then you have the data aggregation layer, as I call it. And here, if we're going to use the data, we must know its provenance. We must be able to trust the data. We must know that it's accurate and secure. And we also want people to share their data in a way that maximizes economic and public good. And this is where blockchains, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, and so on come into play. Then you have the data intelligence layer. And if you've got access to the right and accurate data, the question is how can you utilize that data to make smart decisions, smart predictions, and this is where AI comes into play. And the final layer is really the applications that deliver value using the preceding layers. Here you've got the platforms such as Uber, Facebook, Amazon, autonomous vehicles, drones, digital twins, augmented virtual reality, and so on. Each layer brings its own policy and regulatory challenges. And those nations that understand and develop appropriate policies for each of these layers are likely to see growth of their digital economies over the coming years. Others will be left behind. What we see today is that many governments place disproportionate attention to one or two of these layers. And even then, within those layers, they pay attention to the supply side and not necessarily the demand side of the equation. And you see this, for instance, when governments push for 5G rollout. Policymakers really need to start thinking about how they create incentives for the deployment of high-speed, ubiquitous fixed and mobile networks, how they create the kind of digital aware population through education, training, especially given the increasing nature of cybersecurity threats, how they can strike a balance between open data and the privacy and freedom challenges that new technologies bring, how they address the potential loss of employment and the pressure on wages that increased automation, digitalization, AI will bring about, and my fellow panelists talked about that as well. How they will make up the shortfall in tax receipts in the face of digitalization, and you've seen a lot of governments try to move in this area already. How they can more appropriately regulate new data monoliths and monopolies that transcend national boundaries, and we've seen a few of these already emerge. How they can enhance international trade in the context of digital goods and cross-border data flows whilst maintaining sovereignty. And again, this is quite important for the region that we're talking about. how they address the growing inequalities. Again, this was mentioned before, whether it's in terms of education, access to connectivity, access to digital IDs, or the range of digital services that would be made available. How they can create the safeguards against social biases from the increasing use of AI for decision making. And finally, how they can protect people from the loss of control and manipulation that many may feel through social media, fake news, and so on. And I'm sure there are many others that we can talk about. And none of this is possible through operating in silos. A whole of government approach is required. So each organ of the government, whether it's Ministry of ICT, Ministry of Finance, Transport, Commerce, Education, Health, Environment, need to work together and in the same direction, and work with the private sector to deliver the digital economy in a way that is not harmful to consumers and one that drives the digital economy. Let me pass back to you, Greg. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists, both for your very thoughtful opening statements and for keeping those opening statements fairly short. We'll take the next half hour or so to hopefully have a discussion amongst all of you. I'll, again, throw out a few questions for discussion. You can respond to each other, you can respond to me, but be as engaged with each other as you would like to be. I think we'll break it into two blocks of about 15 minutes each. The first one, let's say, looking at opportunities from digital transformation and how governments and firms can unlock those opportunities. And then in the second half, looking at barriers and challenges to digital transformation in the Middle East. So on the first part of this, of course, we can't see our audience, but imagine there is an audience out there of government officials, of private sector executives who are thinking about working on this issue. For them, for the private sector, which sectors stand to benefit from digital transformation? And particularly, again, in the Middle East, who do you see doing this well so far? Where do you see success stories? Governments, Farid, you mentioned the imperative for job creation. There is at least a rhetorical recognition now from many governments in the region that they need to diversify their economies. They need to focus on job creation, that the era of rentierism is over and large public sectors is over. This digital transformation, how does that fit into plans for diversification and job creation? Are governments fitting it in? Are they seeing the linkages between these things? And also, what does it mean for the social contract in the region and for the sort of safety net that historically, unfortunately, a lot of people have fallen through in the Middle East? What does digitization of government services, of all sorts of services, mean for the social contract in the region? Some broad topics for conversation, but again, feel free to take this in a different direction if you want, based on something that one of your co-panelists said. I think for variety, we'll change up the order here. Isabel, if you don't mind, I'll put you on the spot and start with you here.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. Maybe because I am the only woman on the panel, but when you think about opportunities, I think that digital transformation and especially e-commerce can become an opportunity for women in this region. And it's true that for a lot of them, it was really during the COVID period the possibility to have or to develop activities digitally and try to bypass a lot of interlocutors which are male dominated, especially in the region. And it's why I think that this digital divide regarding gender issue has to be one of the priorities. It's really important to help and to support all female entrepreneurs in the digital world and trying to give them visibility in order to encourage and to incentivize others first. Secondly, I think that regarding what you just said, it's important that the government and the government services together could really help to understand, as I said, the business model, because the economy, it's really finally it's more or less simple. It's just data on one hand and platformization on the other hand. That's the two engines of the digital economy, and understand how platformization and data are combined in order not only in this world, in this developing world, to be client of the big platform, but in capacity to create their own platform, to really develop a cross-board trade, activities, education, contact, socialization, servicification. And on that, it's really the question of literacy is for me absolutely key, not only for women, as I said, but globally also for public authorities. And it's probably could be supported by good collaboration with the private sector and with the entrepreneurs working in this field, because I think that for a lot of people in the government, it's not easy to understand how the model is functioning. Finally, I think that we need for data a global governance, not only a national governance or territorial governance, because there are so many interactions, and I think that we need a global governance on data. That's something which is good for all of us in the framework of this digital. So there are a lot of opportunities, and the COVID-19 and the increasing of perception and consumptions of digital means make more urgent to develop global solution on data, which is also key.
I should say, if anyone at any point wants to jump in, feel free to wave and get my attention. But if you don't, I'll go on to someone else. Gyat, the point that Isabel made about governments needing to recognize these things and understand these things, you mentioned in your opening remarks also about the need for a strategy around this. Do you think governments in the Middle East do understand what all of this means and what they need to be doing?
Yes. Thanks for the question. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. So let me say a couple of issues, raise a couple of issues that are, I see relevant to the region. Digital technology and the growth of digital economy will provide an opportunity to the region to address some of the chronic issues. One of them is economic participation by large sections of the society. So the economic divide between let's say, the economic elite and the rest of the society is quite large in the region, and in many of the countries in the region. And there is a little bit of, difficulties in trickling down the benefit. And that is creating huge economic and social tensions in the society. So the digital economy, as it has proven in many other parts of the world, can lift these marginalized populations and provide them with the opportunity to grow out of their static situation that they have been there for quite some time. And we've seen the social upheaval that came out of this status quo. Now, what does that mean for the government? The other, somewhat unfortunate trend in the region for many years now is the dominance of the government in the economic life of these societies in all aspects. And that is somewhat started also showing in their approaches to the digital economy to various degrees. I cannot generalize on everyone, obviously. But at the end of the day, we all have to recognize that the digital economy is an opportunity to broaden the scope of the private sector, to reduce the economic footprint of the government, and transferring more power to the private sector. It is the private sector at the end of the day that will drive job growth. It is the private sector at the end of the day that will lift the poorer section of the population. And the digital economy is very important. And that's why when I was saying about developing a national digital strategy, it's very important that its preparation involves a broad spectrum of stakeholders who will bring their own perspective of how the digital economy should develop in their societies to the degree that it will help them. So the focus should be really a lot on bringing up the marginalized and the lower sections of societies at the economic spectrum, but also a determined effort to make this, as end of the day, as a private sector initiative and reduce the government footprint in the process.
Thank you. Bharat, if we could go to you, and if I could mention specifically, Isabel made a point about the need of governance for data, and of course you mentioned data as well in your opening remarks. Is that something you see governments in the region tackling, addressing, or is that something that they need to be doing more around?
Yes, good question. I think a lot of the countries in the region, and the first thing to say is the region is very diverse. So you have the GCC countries, and they're on a different level, especially when it comes to digitalization and so on, and you have others. But generally speaking, what you find is a lot of the governments are looking at data protection regulations and laws, which is kind of one part of it. The other part of it is really how do you put a framework where people share their data, where you have open data, where the data can can be used in a way that maximizes value. And I think there, a lot of the region is really not there. They focus, or some of them focus on data protection, but not necessarily the other side of the coin. So actually, when it comes to data governance, I think there really is a lot more work to be done. I think the other thing is, obviously, you talked about kind of the opportunities through digitization. And the first thing is, when you digitize things, when you use the data much more efficiently, you do drive economic efficiencies. And, that has to be a good thing for the countries. And the other thing is, especially when you're talking about the region, a lot of the region is driven, as was said earlier, by public sector, but also by large organizations. And what digitalization does is actually allows the flourishing of SMEs. And that in itself will drive economic growth, but also employment opportunities. So that's something to remember. And those things are driven by the availability of cloud, by e-payments, etc. So the kind of digital ecosystem, when the framework is put in place, it will drive SMEs. So things like cloud, e-payments, open data, etc., all required to be able to drive that SME and entrepreneurial ecosystem. I mean, we've also seen a lot of opportunities that have flourished in the last 2 years because of COVID. So e-health, e-education. We're also seeing a lot of manufacturers now automating their kind of supply chains. So I think we're seeing a lot happening in the region. But as I said in my opening remarks, I'm not sure it's a coherent approach. It's kind of haphazard, and some people focus on elements of the kind of overall ecosystem that's required. So I think progress is happening, but unfortunately, I think a lot more work is required.
And Farid, we'll come to you finally. We've heard some talk over the past few minutes about what this could mean for e-commerce, particularly for women, about small and medium enterprises. Of course, these sorts of topics, I'm sure, are topics that are on your mind as well. And so why don't you talk to us about what this means for job creation, diversification for the broader economy?
Thank you. Look, all I heard, I agree with. Clearly, these are issues that are the center of our agendas here. I'll make 3 points and possibly a fourth one on data. One is, when I look at the Middle East and North Africa, and I'll keep focusing on that region anyway. So from Morocco to Iran, these are the countries that I'm interested in right now. The role of the state in the economy in each one of these countries is overwhelming, has been and is today. And as I mentioned earlier, if there is a slice of chance for real sustainable job creation at the level and the scale that is needed in the region, this shift from a public sector driven economy to more role for the private sector is absolutely essential. This is no doubt about it. We are hammering it day in and day out, and it is tough. It is tough because we are looking at half a century or more of that tradition when it comes to the independent states, let alone what was before that. All of the other organizations that preceded colonialism, etc., in that part of the world. So it is a tough nut to crack. So this is one. Second, the reality is the following. When I go country by country and talk to the young people in these countries, notably the young entrepreneurs, and notably those who are now, interested in the digital economy, look at all of those young people moving on startups, for instance. They are doing amazing stuff. They are creative. They are opening spaces. They are sometimes going around, government regulations in order to move with their businesses, which of course makes it a bit, unsustainable down the road. But still, they are doing as much as they can. And when I ask them, what can the World Bank do to help you? The answer uniformly is, please get the state off of our back. That's it. That's the bottom line. The state is too big, too heavy, too regulated, every time they feel there is an issue, they issue a law and they adopt a regulation, and it becomes totally unsustainable for these young people to be able to to express themselves. Third, you said it, digitalization is a tool, and only a tool. That's it. And we should not make it for more what it is, but it is a very fundamental tool. A fundamental tool that would allow us to move on one of the most difficult agendas that we are dealing with here in the Middle East and North Africa, and that's governance and transparency. If you look at the governance index in the Middle East and North Africa, the data is terribly negative. How can you move and unlock this opacity when it comes to going about businesses and going about the business of government? Well, instilling more digitalization, instilling more automation helps tremendously. And we saw it and we did it. Take the judicial system in a number of countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And I would start with, for instance, Morocco, or we can go to Jordan as well and other places. We and the bank have financed legal and judicial reform projects. The bulk of the investment was on automation, transparency, digitalization of the processes. That helped incredibly the investors, to see that when it comes to going in front of a commercial court, you have predictability, you have transparency, and you have much less space for possible corrupt processes. And that helps also when it comes to giving more assurances or security or comfort to investors, whether it is local or international investors. And again, pushing this whole private sector engagement. Now, some of you mentioned the social contract, bringing me back to my first point. The social contract in the Middle East and North Africa was basically the state is here to basically give you, whatever is needed. And the quid pro quo is that people will just sit there and shut up when it comes to, the framing of policy, of public policies. What happened over the last, 20, 30, 40 years is, one, there is a new generation of young people who would like to have something to say. Second, the world has changed tremendously with, television and people talking to each other and access to information. So the young people that were supposed to be sitting there and waiting for their government to decide for them are now asking, to play more of a role there. And that meant that, the whole equilibrium started to change. You add to it that the governments are not now, and have not been for quite some time, in a position to finance, those subsidized services. They can't anymore. So basically, on the one hand, the government cannot afford to supply all of these goods and services, basic goods and services to the people. And on the other side, people are not, sitting there and waiting for something to happen to them because they feel that they need to have their say. So that whole equilibrium of the social contract was disrupted. And this leads me to
if I could ask you just to wrap up in the next 30 seconds so we can get one more round in. Thanks.
Well, I'm happy to wrap up right now if you want me to, but I think that the issue of human capital, which is my last point, is also absolutely fundamental. Education, health, social protection. These are the main drivers of our agenda when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa. And this has a direct impact on what we are doing when it comes to opening up the economy to the private sector. You need to have an education system that brings young people to a place where they actually can, move on, this whole creativity, this innovation, and understand what's happening beyond, their borders. And this is really something that we need to keep in mind. So human capital is there, and go back to what was said earlier on gender. Absolutely. When I look at MENA today, 20% of women are employed today in MENA, at a time when, in fact, women are way more performing when it comes to the education system. That too is an issue that we need to keep in mind, because it has a lot to do with improving the investment climate and improving the capacity for MENA to step up to the plate in this coming years. And sorry for being long.
Very good segue. No. And that's a very good segue actually into the next round of questions that I wanted to ask. We've talked about opportunities. Let's talk about challenges in a few areas in particular. One of them is exactly as you said, education. STEM education is becoming more popular in the Middle East. It's not always available. It's not always of the best quality. And of course, it's not just a matter of getting a degree and you're done. It's something that has to be constantly updated, which has not always been the case for a lot of the labor market, a lot of the human capital in the Middle East to have sort of ongoing training and education. Physical infrastructure, you have huge differences between countries. Some have raced ahead with 5G, fiber to the home, local cloud capacity and data centers. Others lag well behind the world average, even on broadband connectivity speeds. Data privacy seems like it potentially is an issue as well. This is not a region that has robust laws or regulations protecting the privacy and security of data, whether it's owned by individuals or corporations. It's also a region where not just with digital economy, but with the economy writ large, there are big issues doing business across borders because of regulation, where you have far too little trade, for example, between countries in this region compared to other regions. So it seems like there are a lot of obstacles to digitization, to the digital economy in the Middle East, and would be good to hear from our panelists about what everyone, governments, firms, etc., should be doing to try and ameliorate these challenges. So Giyat, if we could start with you this time.
Thank you, Greg. It is true. I mean, the challenges are enormous, and it is exacerbated by the really broad spectrum of conditions in the Middle East. We have low-income countries, we have post-conflict countries or conflict countries, we have highly rich countries, enormous resources. So there is a broad diversity. So it's difficult really to paint a one brush for all. However, there are some commonalities that can be seen. So an important issue is approaching and developing the digital economy, as we said, has to be rooted in the development and social objectives. These development and social objectives has to be clear and has to be presented to the public, and how the digital economy will achieve, will link to these objectives and achieve these objectives. And that's very important to gain the trust of the population. Now, that being said, so there is at the end of the day resources needed to move forward the agenda, and resources need to be managed appropriately and efficiently, and that is where the role of planning ahead of time through digital national strategies, let's say, will be critical for the region, and that is not there yet. The state of planning for the digital economy varies quite a lot. Many countries have adopted sub-sections, sub-plans, let's say, focusing on certain sections, let's say mobile payment or government segment, but as of now, we don't see a holistic approach to the whole region. And why is that is important? Again, one, to give a signal of how to achieve the development and social objective, but also to make sure that resources are not spent unnecessarily. And that is a big risk where if these efforts are not coordinated properly. Lastly, it is really, again, I would like to re-emphasize the point that were made by my colleagues here. These effort has to reduce the public sector footprint at the end of the day and open up the opportunities for the private sector to grow. And the leapfrogging nature of the digital technology could actually help move away from some of the status quo situation that we find many countries are stuck in at present. Whether the status quo is driven by regulation, by inertia, by conditions, We've seen that in other countries around the world, where countries in Africa, where mobile payment suddenly made a huge difference, notwithstanding all the inertia and issues that they are facing, which in many ways could be similar to the MENA region. It is that commitment at the high level to these ideas, to these processes, that will help move the region forward. And hopefully more and more authorities in the region will realize that this is in their best interest and their best interest of their societies, and move forward accordingly.
Bharat, you mentioned in your opening remarks, you said connectivity doesn't necessarily mean 5G. And I wonder if you can elaborate a bit on what you meant by that and on sort of the broader question of physical infrastructure in the Middle East.
Yeah, sure. So what we see is a lot of governments are pushing for 5G. And for some reason, they think that 5G is the panacea to everything digital. And in most cases, the current connectivity that we have with 4G is more than enough for most of today's applications. 5G comes into play when you get into things like gaming and virtual reality, augmented reality, etc. So actually, by imposing a very high cost in rolling out 5G, you're not really benefiting a lot of people. The focus could be spent on kind of expanding 4G coverage across the country, for instance, in ensuring that that consumers have access to the right devices by focusing on those things rather than pushing for 5G. Because 5G, in many senses, is a technology that will be useful maybe in 2 or 3 years' time, when the right applications come along. So my view is a lot of governments are pushing this because they somehow think it's a panacea, and it's not. And actually, from investment side, the kind of business cases aren't there yet. So a lot of the operators are kind of hesitant in making those investments today, when they know that there's really not much chance of getting a return on them, at least in the short term. So that's the first thing to say. In terms of physical infrastructure, yes, I mean, there's a wide diversity of countries, right? So in the GCC, you have most of the countries have 5G, most of them have high-speed fiber to the home. But when you're looking at some of the other countries, some countries are still on 3G. Some have implemented 4G, but may not have ubiquitous nationwide coverage. So actually, the focus, if we're talking about equality of access to digital services, then the focus needs to be on making sure that everybody has access to high-speed, affordable coverage. And affordable doesn't mean just the connectivity. It also means access to devices, access to other digital services, etc. So actually, there's a kind of range of things that governments need to look at. One other thing to say, I'm going back to a comment that Fareed made in the earlier discussion, which is entrepreneurs are complaining about regulations and government interference. I think that's true. But I think the other thing is what the other thing he made was predictability, and that's actually vital. Investors need predictability in terms of policy and regulations, and what we find is a lot of the governments and the regulators they see an issue and they suddenly issue a new regulation, and that's not what's needed. What's needed is a framework that provides predictability, but doesn't hinder the kind of entrepreneurship and the activities that a lot of the SMEs and a lot of large companies are trying to do. So actually, there's this balance between kind of no interference from the government, but also having a kind of framework which gives you long-term predictability, so people can actually invest. And that's the thing that we're looking for as well. So when governments force you to do 5G, it doesn't really provide that predictability because there's no return on investment in that sense. And unless they have a digital strategy that talks about the long-term roadmap. So if they have a plan in terms of what they're going to do for e-government, what they're going to do for smart cities, what they're going to do in terms of e-transport, etc., unless they have this roadmap, it's very difficult for investors to invest, the billions of dollars that's required to invest in a 5G network. Let me pass back to you, Greg.
Okay, thank you. Fareed, if you can talk about... Sorry,
yes,
go ahead. Were you going to say something?
I just wanted to, yes, because one of the issues that we've been struggling with is precisely the last point that was made here. Talk about regulation for this particular industry. things are moving so fast. Progress is made, in light speed. And when we get into a discussion with any government, asking us for advice, frankly, we find ourselves in a bind. How can you advise, and be true to what we're supposed to be doing, when in fact none of us, I guess, knows what tomorrow literally will be made of. So that the discussion about predictability when it comes to the regulation is really a question mark. So I'm wondering whether you could just give us a bit, since you are the way the technician here, give us a sense of how can we frame that conversation with our clients.
Sure. So I get what you're saying, and we see this in the cryptocurrency world today, for instance. And if you look at a lot of the kind of real kind of vested individuals in this area, they want predictability, they want regulations, because that they believe that will drive the industry, rather than what we have today, which is uncertainty. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Tomorrow will they suddenly come up with regulations that will hamper their businesses? So actually, people need certainty. And as you say, sometimes you can't have regulations when the market is still nascent. But what you can have is a policy framework to say, these are the things that we're interested in. These are the areas we will intervene. If we see X, Y, Z, this is where we intervene. These are the areas we believe that we want investment, innovation to happen. So I think providing a policy framework at least gives you a bit of predictability. But I agree with you in terms of regulations. Sometimes it's too early to introduce them, and we're at that stage now in some of these technologies where it's probably too early. And another example is AI, for instance. AI is whilst it's been there for 50 years, we're at a stage where it's really advancing and it's actually having practical use cases. But again, we need a framework in terms of how it will be regulated. And the EU's come up with a framework which is very much a risk-based regulated framework. The US has another framework, which is we want to make the maximum economic value out of this, and we will refrain from regulation. So again, the governments can provide a kind of policy framework which gives comfort to the investors in terms of where the governments might be going. And that in itself is actually quite useful to have.
Greg, if I could quickly jump in on the regulatory issues, because this is really
sure, and then we'll go to Isabel after you.
Right.
Okay.
So, I'm sorry, Isabel, you want to start? Please go ahead.
No, it's the same. I also wanted to react to this issue of regulation, because that's a key issue. It's true. And I agree that it's a balance between a regulatory framework and specific issues. It's why first, I think that the strategy has to be decided on national level. Which are the things, of course, cryptocurrencies, it's maybe for later, which is urgent on short term or middle term in the country to do to support digitalization. Secondly, it's true that we have also to look at not only the problem that for digital solution, but how digital solution could create problems, not only for investors, but also for consumers. Protection of consumers, and what you said about connectivity is also important regarding the remote areas, because probably 5G or even 4G, it's nice in the cities, but in a lot of countries, probably in the Middle East, but everywhere, even in the developed countries where you have 5G, in some remote area, it's not the case. It's important to guarantee access for all people and all consumers, but also dispute, because you have also all the rules that's regulation which could be taken relatively easily, how to protect people against a false product, a dangerous product, something which is really avoiding or passing all the rules and sell through the digital means on a way which is dangerous for health, dangerous for kids, dangerous for I don't know who, but well, that's something which is really regulator, easy to take. It's not only the way. And finally, about what you said about the role of the state in the Middle East, which is too big, and that the young people would like really not to have the state in their back. It's true that even in the country where the state is less pregnant or less present, and where the young entrepreneurs are more free to develop their project, digital technologies are disruptive for all of us, not only for the government in the Middle East, but everywhere. It's totally disruptive with a lot of unpredictability what will happen later. And it's true that it requires some action from the government in order to really trying to protect against the negative impact of digital solution, because it could be really something very useful for the young population, but it could also become something which is without enough regulation, something very dangerous for a lot of population. I see what happened in developed world with Uberization. The excessive Uberization is also something which could become problematic to a certain extent. Of course, we are not there in the developing world. Nevertheless, I think that we have to prevent, to repeat the same kind of problems that some developed countries are facing with Uberization and really a disruptive effect on all the social contract in those regions.
Gyat, you had a point you wanted to make.
Right. Also, coming back to the issue of Bharat raised, I mean, the policy framework is super critical for investors and entrepreneurs to engage in the digital economy. And that is why the adapting and developing a national digital economy strategy is becoming more and more important and prevalent, and many more countries are doing it. That's basically a broad policy framework. Now, whether within that framework we can provide regulatory certainty, that's not true, because technologies are evolving, its impact is evolving, and authorities, oversight authorities are evolving with that. So the regulatory regimes is moving forward, but at a slow pace, and that just reflects the nature of the beat itself. However, there are certain things that authorities can and should do to facilitate this process. Let me mention quickly a few of them. The nature of the digital technology is cross-sectoral, and which means that oversight authorities must coordinate among themselves, even those who do not naturally or traditionally have talked to each other, competition authorities, banking, or mobile operator authorities. So they have to start talking to each other, find some process, some forum where they discuss these issues among themselves and leverage their collective knowledge. And that is an important issue that we are seeing more and more in many countries are moving into that direction. Also, authorities can improve their monitoring system of how the digital economy is developing, and we don't see much effort on that front. Many times, oversight authorities are surprised or caught by surprise when these developments happen. So that means continuous engagement and dialogue with the key players, just simply talking to the key players in this industry. But not only that, on the production side, but also on the consumer side. The oversight authority must understand how the consumer is using digital product and services. This is an area we often forget about, and what is the interaction between the digital and physical product. These are important to bring up the understanding of the regulators, not only in general for the digital technologies, but also within the jurisdiction they are operating in. Different countries may have different conditions. Finally, the oversight authorities really must make an effort to build up their internal human digital capacities. And that comes to the learning, but it's not learning to the public, but also that the authorities themselves learn these skills. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for them to engage with their constituencies. So let me stop here and back to you, Greg.
Okay, and you timed that perfectly because we're down to about our final minute here. So unfortunately, we could keep going on with this for a while, but we are out of time, and I'm sure everyone has other things that they need to be doing as well. So to wrap up briefly, it seems like the state needs to get out of the way, but the state also needs to be in the way, because the state needs to be there as a regulator. The state needs to understand that 5G is not connectivity, but it also needs to invest in things like 5G. Some of these perhaps seemingly contradictory points, you can put them all together and say there needs to be a holistic approach to this. It's not something where the state is simply going to make regulations. It needs to be done in conjunction with the private sector. Different pieces of the private sector need to be talking with each other in a way that they might not have in the past. And there needs to be a much more holistic approach to this than perhaps there has been in some countries in the region. Thank you to all of our panelists, to Farid, to Isabel, to Gyat, and to Bharat. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us this afternoon. Thank you to the Ministry of Economy and Planning of Saudi Arabia for supporting this session. And a final reminder, again, this is the second in a series of events that we're doing on the evolving economy. So I would encourage you to look out for the next ones and tune into those when they're available. Thank you very much.